Okay. What is exception handling? You know it, right? See, the ultimate purpose behind writing a code is that it should be error free. Okay, that's how the application works, right? And now the application will work with error. Okay. But what might happen is that due to some unavoidable circumstances or due to various external factors or even due to some critical scenarios, the code might end up in error. What will happen if the code ends up in error? It might do something very fishy to the code, or it will do some sort of unnecessary stuff to the function that is already working. So basically, what you should do is that whenever a code throws an error, you have to handle that. You have to handle that in the sense you need to catch that error that actually occurs on the code, and you need to show them the customized message instead of actually showing what the error it is. Okay, or you can catch the error and try to do some other coding. Okay, it's kind of precautionary thing that you're supposed to do in case of error. That's what the normal terms tells you. That's what exception is all about in coding as well. How important is to write a class for a program is similar to that. Writing exception is very essential part, right? Even if you go for interviews, people or some other project that you try to start, right? I urge you people to always start with the exception. Put a try and then start write the code. I repeat, always start writing a code by putting up the exception, the try block. Okay. Now let me give you an example, a plain example. Okay. My div is equal to 10/100, 0. Okay, when you run the specific code, it throws error because you know that you cannot divide a number by 0. This is actual fact that most of us know. But the problem with this kind of error is that, look at this. You're getting something like traceback. What is traceback? It is trying to go back to the place where the error actually is occurred. Okay. But ultimately, you know that it is exposing the folder structure. What you should do as a programmer, you should not expose any part of your system, where the code is hosted, where the server it is, what are the folder it was, hosted and all. So make sure that you avoid that. And also what happened here? It is exposing the line which got actually the error. Imagine we work for a banking customer and if you throw error like this, what happened? It is a cakewalk for the hackers to easily get into the system and do whatever they want to do. And at last, as usual, what type of error it is and what is the cause of the error. So these are the traceback that you usually get when a system throws error. So this you shouldn't be doing it. When you know that there is a cause or there is a case where you're gonna get an error, make sure that you handle it. Okay. So I'm gonna handle these 2 lines of code using the exception. Try, and you need to put except. You need to put except. Look at that. When you ran, now look at the error that I got on the top and at the bottom. At the top, you got the traceback error and the entire history of the particular lines of code is displayed. But here, what happened? You were giving the customized message. So now what happened? You are actually hiding the actual error from the end user. This is what you should do. Of course, it is a customized, error. People may not understand the clarity why this error has been occurred. But at least you should be in a position to understand that yes, there has been an error that occurred. So this is how the basic exception works, as the basic syntax was. A try block that contains a block of statement followed by the except, which is going to catch the error. So this is what the actual exceptional block. Okay. Now if you ask me more, I understand this is the exceptional block. What are the exceptions that it will actually do the catching? It will catch any kind of exception. Look at that. Even if you put some type errors, you know that what happened a plus 10, you cannot add a string with that of a number, very obvious. So when you run, it will catch that error as well. So basically this except block is what we call it as default exception block. That means whatever may be the error of your system, it will get caught. So this is what we call it as default exception. Okay, this is some kind of old school kind of a catching where you will catch with a generalized thing, But as we go further into the code, right, we'll explain about the deeper part of the code as well. But this is the basic syntax of exception. Okay. Another thing that I want everybody to understand is that Python do contains a class called exception. This is the base class for all the exception that occurs on the screen. It's like, zero division error, type error, value error, index error. Okay, this is what exception is all about. It contains all these subclasses: zero division error, type error, value error, index error. This is just an example I'm telling. There are a lot of errors to it. Okay, so the basic understanding is that yes, all this class comes under this base class called exception, capital E. Okay, that exception. Under this class only, all these exceptions are getting derived. Okay. Now, what is next step that we usually do? Try optimize the code. That's what we do. So let us try that operation. Look at that. Now, now what is this? I am trying to catch a specific error. If you argue with me more, the same thing, same code is actually happening at the previous line with the one except block, and now you're trying to have a two except because one is a default, another one is a specific exception. What is the ultimate purpose of this? It will try to catch in a quicker way because you're very specific, right? If I ask you people to come to my home just by giving the area, it is tough for you to come, right? If I give you the entire Google Map ID, it is easy for you to come back and sit in my home. Same thing happens when you give the specific exception. It is easy for code to understand and come back to the exceptional block. That's what we call it as specific exception. Okay, but what happening here? Look at that. It catches this error because this particular line belongs to type error. Now, in these specific lines of code, when I try to catch some other exception, for example, if a code comes up with some other error, what will happen? It will go to the default block. Sorry, oops is the print of the default block because you caught only the type error, but the code that you have as a part of your syntax is actually belong to some other error. So it will come back to the default block. Okay. The learning from here is that you can specify an exception that you understood or you predict that it might come to make sure that the error catching happens fastly. But on a precautionary, it is always good that you keep some default exception at the last so that when the exception that you given as a default one does not match, at least it will come to the last executable statement, at least the default except block. This is what we call it as exception handling with the better cars. Okay, so the default exception, the one which you see, one second, one which you see at line number 25 should be the last statement. You cannot keep the default exception first and you cannot keep the specific at the last. Look at that. Just for example, I'm telling this is something that I want you to try, but still look at that. Default except must be the last. Okay, so it should be always the this. Because why the default? What is the meaning of default, right? When it doesn't satisfy under any criteria, at least you go and satisfy the last and by default criteria, right? That's what it actually means. It will go and check on the default statement. So this is what exception is all about. Now, again, we're gonna optimize it in a better way. What is this specific exception? Good. And you're trying to print. So whenever the type error happens, you're trying to print this particular statement. Now, if you tell me, if you ask me that Mohan, whether the end user will get understand the error case, definitely no, because you're telling them to try again. So what they do, they'll just try to come back to the code and run, but they will not understand what could be the cause for the error. So as a developer, right, we should be very specific in telling the end user that what is the reason for the error that actually occurred. Okay. So how do we do it? As I told in the line number 16, every exception that you see in a real time has their own meaning. why that error will occur, what could be the cause that error might occur. That you can retrieve it by the simple syntax called as ex. As ex means it's a kind of a class statement. From the given type class, you're trying to get the meaning of that particular error. Now when you run, it will go to the sorry block only because the error that you have is 10 by 0. Let me just go back to the older one. Now this is type error. Look at that. If you want, let me rerun that again. There you see. It gives you the detailed one. Correct, right? It gives you the detailed one. At least from the user perspective, they'll try to understand, okay, this might be the error. Let me just reshuffle the code or redefine the code again. Okay, this is how you can write the optimized code. Okay, now what you did at line number 22 is that you're trying to say that, please do a catch if at all a type error comes into picture. But you know that there could be another exception that can come. What you can do? You can do that this way also. When you run, look at that. Let me just put the zero dictionary there. There you see. So basically what happened? In a single try block, you can have a many except. I repeat, in a single try block, you can have any number of except block. There is no restriction, but the only condition is that the default should be the last one. A try can have any number of exception, and even it can be without except block. This is something that book also don't teach you. Okay, a try block can be sitting without except block. Instead of except block, we're gonna put some other block called finally, which we're gonna see it bit later. But at least you'll understand try can have any number of except or even no except. But if you have except, the default should be the last. Now, what are line number 22 and 24? You're trying to see whether the code comes up with this error exception handling or this exception handling. And the common sense prevail should tell us, at a time there could be only one error that can occur as a part of the code. Very common sense, right? There is no way that it is going to catch two exceptions at a time. Only one error at a time. Whatever that prioritized, that will caught. So instead of you writing this in a separate statement, you can write it within a single statement. Look at it. That's it. It is much simpler than the previous one, right? What actually happening? You are trying to catch an exception, and you know that there could be a lot of exceptions that can come as a part of the code. Instead of you defining that the different except block one after the other within a single except block, you are trying to catch all the exception as part of it. Now it is easy for you to get the code. Correct? It is easy for you to get the code as it is. This is what exception handling is all about. The optimized way of handling the exception. Okay? Check it out, and rest of things I'll teach you. Good. So this is how the exception is done. Okay. Now, what I told, if you put a single try, at least you can have one except block or some other block. But what is very necessary is that you need to write except block. Okay. But adding to this, there are two other blocks which is not mandatory. That is very much an optional. Whenever there is a case for you to use, you can use that. What are those blocks? The first block is else statement. Okay, now when I run, look at that. That particular else block is not getting printed. So the else here with the exception is usually works in similar to that of how the else works in if statement. When the else will get printed, if the condition that I give as a part of is this get not getting satisfied, that is where it will come to the else block, right? Similarly, here in exception handling, if there is no error that occurs on the try block, that means what? If this except block is not getting executed, that is where it will come to the else block. So this else is for this except. When there is no except block, it will come to the else block. Let me just show you that as well. 10 by 2. This is now not an error because 10 can be easily divisible by 2. So now there is no exception that is going to happen. If there is no exception, the else. So the except block will work as if statement. If that doesn't get printed, it will come to the else block. They are using else block print statement is getting printed, and you can use this else block kind of else statement. That means whenever you write a code in such a way that you can define two things. When error comes, execute the things that is on the exception block. If there is no error, then execute the thing that is there in the else block. This is how you can write a code. Okay, I'll tell you, and I'll tell you the real-time scenario where you can use this else block. Okay, now adding to this, there is another block which we call it as finally. Finally block. So when I run these specific lines of a code, you look at that. The else is getting printed because there is no error. But the finally block is again printing. So now let me put error case and see if the final is getting printed. Yes. So the else block is something is very specific. When there is no exception, else will get printed. For finally block, there is no such scenarios. Whatever that happens on the try block, the finally will work for sure. I repeat, whatever that happens on the code, the finally will always happen. So again, I'll tell you the scenarios when you can use this particular finally block. Okay, what is the time that you use the finally block? I'm going to explain you about some DB related operation. Okay, so during that scenario, I'll help you people with this finally else block usage in a real time scenario. So this is what it is. So else and finally are non-mandatory block of a statement for any exception. If at all a situation demands you to use, you can use it. If not, you can simply leave that. And one additional criteria is that the finally block should be the last executable block. You cannot keep final and else at the bottom. Either you keep else statement separately or you do the finally statement separately. No issues. But the only criteria is that finally should be last block when you keep it together. Okay, this is what it is. Now what you did was, you taken monumental effort to do this kind of exception, put except block, else block, finally box, print this, print that, and so many things. Now I'm going to make life very easier by defining a simplest of a statement. Since you already worked upon else and finally, let me remove that. Now, what are these block? This is the block where you're trying to catch a specific exception so that you can define a user with a clear cut reason to it, and you define a default exception whenever there is a case where you may not predict what kind of error. Now, instead of you writing these two blocks, it is better that you keep these things into control. Look at that. Now, in the previous case, what you are trying to do is that you are trying to catch error when system throws you. So you are asking your Python to do the operation on your behalf. But here, what is that? The absolute opposite. You are giving that control back to the exception. So saying that, look, I'm not going to define any specific exception nor the default exception. So I'm giving it to you. Who is this? This is the guy whom I'm told as a base class. Correct? Whom I'm told as a base class. So I'm just I'm handing it over to the base class saying that, look, I'm not gonna, or I'm not sure what kind of error that is gonna come. So whatever that error comes on the line, please do catch and give me the meaning. So now look at that. It will give the meaning. Now if it is some other error, say, look at that. So any error can be caught with this single line of a statement. Now you can argue with me saying that why can't you tell this in the very first instead of you teaching all these scenarios. It is always good to know the history, how the exception was handling, and now how the exception is being handled. Okay, that's where you'll get to know the clarity and the optimization or the legacy that it taken over from the previous version. Okay, so this is the better optimized solution. And else and finally, as usual, if at all the situation need you to use the exception with the else and finally, you can use that. But my preference would be always this block when you go for exception. Instead of you going and define a specific exception and put as EX, and then you define 3 to 4 exception, and then you're defining a normal default. No, don't take that cross route. Always take this better route. Okay, check on this. Once you're done, I'll tell you about few more scenarios that you need to work upon in exception handling. Good. Okay. Now, whatever the exception that we seen from the very start is something that system detects. Okay. System is detecting some error. But what you can do is that you can even raise the exception even though there is no error. Look at that. You know, it is actually the normal if statement. There is no error. But still you can raise an error. Raise index error. Now, the beauty here is that there is no index error, but still you can raise and catch that. That's it. Okay. Now what happens whenever the index error comes? I mean, whenever this if condition getting satisfied, it will go on raise this specific error. This is something that you do it on some situational demands where you know that the system will not raise any exception, but still if you want to raise an exception for some specific condition, okay, not necessarily error case. You can use this exception block for some other alert kind of a statement where this comes alert with the exception. So during those cases you can do the raise error, okay, raise of these kind of exception. Okay, only thing that you shouldn't be doing or you should not be doing is that never try to catch this as EX, which I tried in the previous cases. Okay, so now in previous cases, this EX will throw us the error why the actual, I mean, it will throw the meaning why the actual error is coming. But in this case, it will give you the empty output because you're trying to get the meaning for the error that was not caught by the system. This is something that you raising it. That means you're externally raising an exception. So in this case, you cannot expect the system to throw a meaning to it because if the system throws a meaning, then it will become useless because system should throw error if it is a valid error. But here there is no valid error, correct? But what you can do, you can customize the error here itself. Look at that. I raised the exception. Now, if you give the meaning, that can be caught at the exception block. Look at that. So this is how the raise method works. So you need to make sure that you always raise the method or error that is already known by the system. And if at all you need to predefine the reason for the error, you have to do in such a way that how I defined line number 63. Okay. If you don't define that inside a parenthesis why you are raising that error, you cannot catch that by using the EX method. So be clear. Okay. Now here what you tried is that you're trying to raise the method which system knows by default. What if you're trying to catch an error which is system doesn't know? Look at that, something like my error is not at all a part of a system. It means it is not at all part of the exception based class because exception based class contains only the errors which it knows, but here the my error is not part of the code. So when you run, it throws error at raise method as well as it is throwing error at the catch method because system cannot detect this kind of error. But still what you can do is that you can make this kind of error that Python doesn't know by default also to be an exception. This is what we do call it as user defined exception. I repeat, this is what we do call it as user defined exception. Okay, for that what you have to do is that first of all you need to create a class with that particular exception name which you are raising, and as you know, you need to accept the characteristics of your base class, inherit. Basically we need to see the class. Maybe if we see the class, you will get to know what is this inheritance all about, right? So now what happens, you're trying to big the base class exception to produce all the attribute of its to the my error. Now basically we are making sure that my error is also part of this default exception. That's why I'm creating a class. So whenever you want to create a user defined exception, make sure that you create a class on top of it Once once you create a class on top of it, what you can do now, try to inherit a base class exception so that it will get categorized as a user defined exception. Look at that. That's it. This is what we call it as user defined exception. You try this. After this, I'll explain you one more thing where you can keep the meaning here itself and how to get it back here. For that, you need to understand the class. Okay. So do this and we'll see the rest of the topic.